Righty. Welcome everyone to Equality Bahamas's 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. This is our session with Barrise Griffin, and we will be discussing managing disasters and generally just talking about her as master of disasters and what that entails and what risk management involves in the context of natural disasters. So I want to just remind everyone that we are recording this live stream. We're also live streaming on Facebook, the recording will be uploaded later on to YouTube. So if you would like to remain anonymous, just remember to use the chat function to ask any questions or comments that you may have. I want to remind everyone that this is a respectful space, and so any misogyny, sexism, any of the isms, homophobia, transphobia, anything like that, will not be tolerated. There will be no warnings, and you will be ejected and not allowed to return. So let's just be respectful. We want to give everyone a chance to be, heard, and we want to respect everyone, like the differences in opinions. So without further ado, I will allow Barry's to tell a little bit about herself, who she is, what she does, and then we'll just dive right into any questions that folks might have. Oh, sorry, I will dive into the questions we have, and then, yeah, toward the end, we'll take questions from members in the audience.
No problem. Thank you, Khadija, and thank you, Equality Bahamas, for having me on the 16 Days of Activism tour. I really appreciate it. So my name is Barrise Griffin, and I am the Master of Disaster. So I am a disaster risk specialist and a development specialist working in the Bahamas on disaster risk management initiatives for the Bahamas. I have currently about almost 5 years under my belt in disaster management. And yeah, I'm glad I ended up in this field because it is an interesting field. No 2 days are the same. And it's always something to do and think about as we continue to improve disaster management strategies in the Bahamas. Oh, you're muted.
Might help to unmute. So, yeah, tell us a little bit about the relatively newly formed, what is the abbreviation for it again?
The DRM Authority.
Okay, the DRM Authority, right? Disaster Risk Management Authority. Okay.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about, first of all, like what is a master of disasters, and kind of in the context of managing, disasters, what would you like, what is your role?
Okay, so I'll just put this disclaimer out there. I will be switching between two hats during this. So I will be wearing the Master of Disaster hat, which is me, Barry's the Disaster Management Specialist. And then I'll be switching to the Assistant Director of Planning, Mitigation, and Research for the DRM Authority hat as well. So I'll juggle both of those personalities and the limitations and strengths that come from each. So with the DRM hat on, I can say the DRM Authority is the new entity in the Bahamas that manages disaster risk management activities completely in its entirety. So within the disaster management cycle, we have preparedness, mitigation, response, recovery, and rehabilitation. And then it all circles back again after an event, during an event. So the DRM Authority it came about through the newly formed legislation, the Disaster Risk Management Act, that was passed in Parliament in 2022. And it merged the entities of NEMA, the National Emergency Management Agency, with the Disaster Reconstruction Authority, which came about post Hurricane Dorian, because it was recognized that these two institutions, these two agencies had pretty much the same mission, the same purpose, and the same goal, but they were working in silos pretty much. So NEMA really was handling more of the response activities and sometimes the preparedness activities for disaster management, whereas the DRA was focusing more on the recovery after a disaster, mainly reconstruction. So the government thought that it's better to come up with a holistic, comprehensive approach to disaster management and merging these two entities and their missions and their goals into one institution, which is now the Disaster Risk Management Authority. And within the legislation, also comes more focus on policy and governance for disaster management. So there are multiple, I think there are about 14 policy instruments within the legislation that deals with all all parts of the disaster management cycle to make sure that every aspect of disaster management has a focus and has an area instead of just working on disaster response and disaster reconstruction or disaster recovery, because disaster management takes a lot more full body work to really get the job done, and it's about preparing for an event so the impacts of the event will be low. So that is what the DRM authority is tasked with implementing those policy instruments for a robust, comprehensive approach to disaster management.
Okay, yeah, I remember growing up with the hurricanes and them, and used to have a NEMA and stuff like that. So it makes sense. Like that helps me, like, yeah, have a frame of reference for it. I appreciate that. Um, so since you've kind of in that answer explained what disaster risk management, like what does someone like yourself, a disaster risk management specialist, like what do you do?
So for me, sometimes I feel like a glorified project manager because I studied disaster management specifically, but with all of these years and experience in disaster management now, I realize how multifaceted and multi-sectoral disaster management is. And yes, I studied disaster management, but I am not an expert in certain sectors that require disaster management. So, for example, when we look at a disaster manager is someone who creates the policies, strategies to put in place for disaster management activities. So once again, I feel like somewhat of a project manager where I am seeing all the moving parts and I'm trying to work to bring them together to be on the same accord and be on the same page so everybody understands what the plan is. Because if the mission in disaster management is the same across sectors, we need to work together and collaborate all of these sectors because they really depend on each other. So that's my task as a disaster manager and other disaster managers. But if you are a more specialized disaster manager, for example, someone who works in agriculture and has many, many years of experience in agriculture, and then a biohazard disaster event happens, then they are still considered a disaster manager, but they have a more specialized technical approach in the agricultural sector. So this goes across all ministries and all public bodies where someone is more in depth with logistics and public works or even social services aspect of disasters, but they're still disaster managers because they work in the disaster management context.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. Okay. Yeah. And it makes sense. I mean, like a person very rarely can know everything about everything. So that is helpful. So your sort of, I guess, focus is on in hurricanes, or is it?
No, so my particular focus is in natural hazards in general. So because I'm really focused on improving disaster management strategies in the Bahamas, I focus on the hazard profile of the Bahamas. So and also in the legislation, our current legislation for the DRM authority, we only focus on natural hazards. So man-made hazards are out of our direct remit and our direct approach. But as the disaster management entity of the Bahamas, if something is considered or if the prime minister declares something a disaster event, whether it is a natural hazard or a man-made hazard, then the DRM authority will provide support to the lead agency or lead ministry with that. So for example, if there was like an oil spill, then we don't handle that because that's a man-made hazard. But Ministry of Environment would be the point ministry for that. And then we would provide support to them for managing the disaster event, even though we would be the lead agency for natural hazards. So I really specialize in hurricanes, tropical storms, flooding, and wildfires because those are the main hazards in the Bahamas.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. So I think when we think about natural hazards, at least in the Bahamas, we mostly think about storms, right? Hurricanes, tropical storms
Yeah.
at most. Like we don't really see too much wildfires and stuff like that. But
Mhm.
I'm curious, what what made Dorian, I mean, we know how devastating it was, right? So apart from the devastation, could you tell us a little bit about what was particularly devastating, whether it's economically or environmentally, that led, or that was like the catalyst that really led to the legislation and then the formation, like you said, of the agency?
Yes, so Dorian being the most powerful storm on our modern day history, not only because it was a Cat 5 storm, because it's not like the Bahamas has never had a Cat 5 storm before. We've never had a Cat 5 storm to that magnitude, to that wind speed. And then what really made it worse is that Dorian was slow moving. So usually hurricanes come and go in about 24 hours. Dorian stalled out on top of Grand Bahama and Abaco for 48 hours, just sat there at sustained wind speeds of a Cat 5 for 2 days, not moving at all. So that's really where the brunt or the real catastrophe came from because it did not move. So having those sustained wind speeds on a location for 48 hours, over 48 hours, really was devastating because with hurricanes, and this is something that I'm happy is coming about today in the Bahamas, where people are recognizing that outside of hurricanes, flooding is an actual hazard for us. So we get flooding on a regular rainy season day. That is considered a hazard. And I'm glad that's being more promoted as and advocated and thought of as a hazard because that is the most frequent hazard that I can say that the Bahamas faces. And we experience it in hurricane season and outside hurricane season. So Dorian also brought a lot of flooding with it. So it was the sustained wind speeds not moving for over 48 hours, but it's also the water that came up because we are limestone island. So we're a porous island. So the water was coming up through the ground and from the ocean with storm surges. And the storm surges, because the wind was so fast, it's a high wind force. The storm surges were about 23 foot. So imagine 23 feet waves or levels of water. People's second story homes were being flooded, where the entire first floor was flooded and the water was coming up on their second floors, and then they had to go crawl into the roof. So the amount of water and flooding really made Dorian the catastrophe that it was, on top of the wind speed, because the wind is there, but the fact that it didn't move for 48 hours and it brought such wind to be blowing off roofs and blowing trees down and vegetation down on top of the amount of water and the flooding that came through in the storm surging, all of this just was unprecedented. It's something that we haven't experienced before. And it was something that we were completely unprepared to experience because nobody predicted that a storm would just stop moving. That's not the usual characteristics of the hurricanes that we've experienced in the past. We've experienced them doing loops, like doing donuts, running the track back, but just not moving. And also, we have to think about the infrastructure of the islands that Dorian happened on too, because having been to Grand Bahama a few times, I realized that Grand Bahama is very flat, very, very, very flat. And the homes in Grand Bahama are on the ground. So they're not even like a little bit elevated off of the ground. Usually, I think the building code improved now where homes have to be elevated a certain amount of feet up, or even homes were built with a little bit of elevation. But a lot of the homes in Grand Bahama alone were not elevated. So with all of that flooding and everything, it just became a catastrophe because the infrastructure wasn't prepared for an experience or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. That's the worst. I think, I mean, we try to bat up and do what you can, but
Mhm.
you can't fight the forces of climate change. And that's kind of what I'm curious about, like now in 2024, and we're seeing, storms hit Florida, like I mean plummeting,
Back.
or yeah, back to back, and so now it's becoming, I feel like, undeniable, like that natural disasters are getting more intense, more, like more everything, more frequent, like out of seasons, all these things. It's kind of feels in retrospect like we've seen the writings on the wall for a while now, and we kind of, so what is the Bahamas, I guess, like what is our strategy, right? Like,
Hmm.
is there even anything that we can do? Like, what is our position even about, you know, how these storms are
Hmm.
getting worse? And I mean, to some degree, we can't stop climate change altogether, but we are aware of this. So how are we kind of changing with the time, so to speak?
So I'm gonna wear my master of disaster hat on this question and take off the DRM affiliation hat. And I will say that, first of all, I believe that there's always room for improvement in anything that we're doing and everything that we can do. Nothing's gonna be perfect the first time around, but I do want us to try something, anything, and pay attention and acknowledge that there is an issue. So, what I've seen from the Bahamas is that there is somewhat of an interest. Me being biased, I don't think that there's enough interest in it, especially with our focus on tourism. And tourism is such a climate vulnerable sector, climate vulnerable industry. You would think that there would be more robust investment into disaster management and preparedness and mitigation of strategies. But I can say that I'm very proud of the Bahamas for the legislation that it has because it's the first legislation of its kind in the Caribbean, and it does recognize that we cannot return to normal. It's not business as usual anymore because the business is not usual. We're not used to the status quo. But I can say that I personally don't think that it's enough. Anybody can make a policy, anybody can pass a legislation, but when you're not really investing in the implementation of the legislation, that's where I have a problem with because then to me it becomes all fluff, all talk, no action. And as a woman of action, I need to see some action and put the money where the paper is, put the money where the policy is. And if this is something that you actually care about, because all it takes is one hazard. All it takes is one storm to wipe the Bahamas out, for lack of a better term. It really, even 5 years later, post Dorian, Freeport and Abaco still can't catch itself, can't catch its breath after that. And even with that, I think there should have been more robust investment in Freeport and Abaco after Hurricane Dorian as well to improve the situation there. It's been a high rate of migration from Freeport and Abaco since Dorian because there's been no robust investment in their disaster mitigation strategies, but also their livelihoods or investing in livelihoods on those islands and developing those islands. So I think we made a big first step by passing the legislation and passing the policy to say we have to do something differently than what's been done before. But passing the legislation is one step. Investing in this industry and investing in the sector is the most important step because, like I said, all it takes is one storm. And we have always been a very reactive nation in that something has to happen in order for us to invest. We have a lot of blue sky times, but when the gray sky time comes, you didn't have anything in place before the gray sky times, and now you're like wondering what's gonna happen. So strategy wise, I do know a lot is happening behind the scenes and it's being innovative with strategies and mechanisms to support disaster risk management activities. But I want more political will and more political investment in disaster management and climate change specifically. And I want that political will to carry over regardless of what administration is in power because you don't have whatever power, whatever administration is in power, you don't have a country to govern if it's completely wiped out by one hazard. So you have
Yeah.
to make sure that the country is sustained and protected from these hazards in order to keep governing and being in charge of a country.
Yeah. Yeah. That is that we see that a lot in a lot of different uh yeah ways that it's often like it's easy to just say something and it's easy to sometimes just enact something even, but it's much harder to, like you say, have that sustained political will and commitment. So
Mhm.
I'm curious because you at least give the Bahamas its props. I didn't know that this legislation was the first of its kind for the region, which is, it's something, right? Like we
Yes.
we gonna do the work to hold the government accountable, but
Mhm.
I am curious what beyond just, the formation of the DRM authority,
Mhm.
what have you seen the government do that you feel like, okay, that was a good thing there. That was a good little strategy. We could take it a bit further, but and the same, like I have that question in the reverse too. Like if there is something that you feel like has maybe not been in alignment that they've done since the legislation that you, wearing your Master of Disasters hat, would like to comment
Mhm.
on. Um,
Um, so okay, repeat the first half of your question again, please.
if there is something like positive the Bahamas has done
Hmm.
to um say, okay, this is a commitment. We are gonna spend X amount of dollars to, I don't know, enhance the shoreline on the
Hmm.
west on West Bay Street or something like that. Like, is there
Hmm.
anything of that sort that you've seen the Bahamas done to, you know, put
Yes,
money where the policy is?
yeah. Outside of the policy, so I would say establishing the DRM authority is a huge task because having the previous NEMA and the DRA, well, the DRA was also an authority, but NEMA was a department or an agency under the office of the prime minister. And with that came a lot of bureaucracy and red tape, like a lot of hurdles to even get money, to get funds to do anything. So that was a huge barrier to implementation for any disaster management strategy. So establishing an authority, which is a quasi-government or a state-owned enterprise, allows more flexibility for disaster management activities. With its corporate governance structure, it's able to gain funding, collect donations directly from outside or foreign aid rather than having all of that go into the consolidated fund for government, because then the government can do whatever they want to do with the money in consolidated fund. So anything that now directly goes to the DRM authority can be reinvested into disaster management entities. So having that flexibility and that governance and framework structure is a plus and is a win for actually implementing disaster management activity. Now, was the budget in for the DRM authority? Not really. But it's a start. You got to take your wins where you get your wins, and we could keep it moving and keep it pushing from there. But I also can say that the government is investing in climate change or coastal resilience through, I know of an IDB project, an IDB funded project that looks at what is it? Integrated coastal zone management. So it's looking at 4 pilot sites or 4 islands around the Bahamas, and it's installing mechanisms or tools to fortify coastal resilience in areas that have experienced a lot of coastal erosion. So there are about 4 sites in Andros, and Andros is where they're going to implement nature-based solutions. So not a lot of gray infrastructure. There may be some gray infrastructure, but investing in mangrove planting to help with coastal resilience in Andros, across the shoreline in Andros. Then the other side, there's one site in East Grand Bahama, there's one site in Long Island, and then also in New Providence on Junkanoo Beach and Long Wharf. They're looking at how best, especially I don't know if you know, but Junkanoo Beach and Long Wharf is experiencing like extreme coastal flood, shore erosion. So like the beach is barely a beach anymore, and you can just like it's barely a beach. So they're trying to look and see how best to mitigate that coastal erosion. So that's a government loan that they took out through the IDB that's being implemented now. And it's going to take some time for that implementation because it's coastal engineering, and that's always complicated and complex. But that is an initiative in which I think the government is trying to mitigate risk on climate impacts from that. And those are the only two that I'm really familiar with, and I'm sure there's more, but it's not to the degree or magnitude that I would hope. And then the second part of your question was the reverse. What do I think the government is doing that's not in line with all of these big talks and a lot of big talk behind climate change and disaster management. So I would think that not diversifying the economy and still heavily investing and depending in tourism is not in line with a strategic framework for disaster management and climate change. There's this, well, first of all, there's been multiple developments across the coastline in New Providence alone and like Goodman's Bay area and Cable Beach area along that side where I feel like it's way too close on the beach. It's way too close on the shore. And with climate change and a high rate of coastal erosion, eventually you're dredging up sand and you're moving and changing the ecosystems around where I don't think those areas will really be able to sustain themselves if we had a Dorian hit New Providence. Probably that entire beach could be wiped out because you decided to put those high-rise penthouses and condos and hotels on the beach. I don't think that was a smart idea. And then there's also a lot of other development projects going on in New Providence itself, which is very frustrating because we have 700 islands and keys. We like to talk about the 700 islands and keys, but yet everything only on one island. Why are we not developing the other islands with all of these grand development projects and trying to squeeze everybody in Nassau? So there's like project town housing project planning committees talking about creating um development or housing in Adelaide or even Coral Harbor. Coral Harbor floods. Adelaide is a swamp. Why are you trying to build things in areas that have no reason to be built there? You're changing the entire ecosystem, and now people are even complaining, like residents and neighbors in that area are even complaining because places or areas that did not experience flooding before are now being flooded because you're changing the ecosystem. Water has to go somewhere. We're already a limestone island, and you are literally putting concrete on areas where the water used to settle in a disaster or in a rain event. Now that water has no place to go, it's gonna flow until it finds a place to settle, which is in other people's yard that you now are affecting other residents and other livelihoods. So there's a lot of development happening across New Providence that I'm not particularly happy with because it goes against disaster management and it goes against climate resilient strategies because this is just not building back better or this is not a smart investment to make for the long-term sustainability of the Bahamas.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems very counterintuitive, right? Like to keep doing more of the thing that will make you less resilient. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So I want to take a little moment to give anyone in the audience, if they have any burning questions or comments they want to make. I see one comment in the chat from Dylan. He says, in a perfect world, should disaster risk management be handled by corporate entities or government authorities?
So, good question. Thank you, Dill M, for the question. So, in a perfect world, um, I think there's a significant role that government has to play. And I've been doing a lot of research on this when it comes to social accountability. So we as citizens have a invisible social contract with our governments, and our governments have an invisible social contract of us as citizens. There's things that they expect of us, and there's things that we expect of government as well. And within that, I feel that disaster management is one of those things that does fall under the remit of government because if we, and I'm not big on privatizing everything. I'm not a big privatize critical sectors because private entities do not care about people. So in our invisible social contract, the person or the entity more likely to care about people would be government. Do they make the best out of it all the time? No. There are definitely gaps that need to be filled and addressed, and there's definitely hiccups in the social contract. There's definitely breaches in that social contract as well. But with private entities, they do not care about people. People are numbers and people are profit. So if they invest in something and it's not turning a profit for them, they could get up and leave and not care about the people that it was impacting. So there are multiple examples. I'm not going to say in the Bahamas, even though I think in the Bahamas, but in other places where critical industries were privatized, critical industries like electricity and water were privatized. And then when that company wasn't generating the type of profit that they wanted to generate, they left, leaving entire communities without water and without electricity. So something such as disaster management, where the entire country is at stake, and everything in the entire country is at stake, and people are at stake, lives, livelihoods, communities, culture, all of that, I feel, comes with the invisible social contract that we as citizens should expect of our government and hold our government accountable to, because when it's time to pay taxes, they looking at us to pay taxes. They coming at us, they coming for our paychecks, they deducting from salaries, they garnering wages, they going after your house, your home, your livelihood, your dog, everything. They expect that of you. But you as a citizen should be expecting these things of your government as well when it comes to disaster management, because that is just safety in general. That is national security in general, and it's paramount for your government to care about the nation and the citizens.
Yeah. We have another question. I just want to remind everyone that we are streaming on Facebook and we are recording for YouTube. So if you want to ask a question, you are welcome to raise your hand so that you can unmute, or you can use the chat function and we will just read them. So we have another chat question. Says, how do we actually keep them accountable? Oh, I like that one.
Okay. This is one of my favorite topics because I could really go off the deep end with this, but I'm not gonna go as radical as I can go today. And thankfully, I'm wearing my Master of Disaster hat and not the hat that works with and for government. So if my boss is watching this, don't worry about it. I got our best interests at heart. I'm gonna do a good job. So, how do we actually keep them accountable? And this is also what I've been studying in my research and everything with social contracts and accountability. Government and government officials, majority of them are elected officials. So, you are the people that put them in this position and this power. They go around campaigning and advocating for change in your local communities. Your local MPs are giving promises. Governments and government administrations are giving promises. And it's for you as Bahamian people to kind of shift the conversation and shift the focus on, yes, this is what these people want to promise me, but you can also say, this is what I want from you as my representative, that I have to elect in this seat and in this position of power, that I have to trust that I'm paying taxes to eventually if you are elected. So it's a contract, it's a social contract, and it's a dialogue. We need to stop thinking about it as a one-sided monologue. So when these people come to your door saying, I promise to do this and I promise to do that, if those are the things that you want, and it's also strength in numbers. I think we in the Bahamas are losing the plot with community. We really need to be more community focused and community centered, because if Barbara down the road get hurt, don't ever think that it cannot happen to you. It can happen to you. So you need to figure out how best you can help Barbara, because you don't want something like that to happen to you. And you and Barbara are in the same boat with nobody trying to help you. So we do have to bring back that community and strength in numbers. And you as a community should be gathering to say, what do we want as a community to better our community? And then make those requests and make those demands of your government officials, of your elected representatives. You have elected these people into the position of powers. So when they come to your door saying, I promise to do this, I promise to do that, cool, I like that. That's good for our community. But we also want this. And then you also have to hold them accountable within a reasonable timeline. So if you are saying, okay, they come in with all these social policies and all this stuff, that's going to take a while. That's like a 3-year goal, 2-year goal, whatever. I just want the roads in my community fixed. I want all the potholes patched up. And politicians campaign, and of course they say, yes, absolutely, I'm going to do that for you. So you elect them in power. 6 months later, a year later, a year and a half later, it's not being done. You need to go back community-wise as well, not even just individualized. You need to go back to your politician and said, you tell me if I put you in power, you was gonna fix my roads within a year and a half time. It's a year and a half and these roads still ain't fixing. Now my car in the shop because I blow a tire dropping in one of these potholes. What's up with that? Hold them accountable. They said they were going to do X. Continue to follow up with them on those conversations on saying, you could do X, you can do X. And extend grace where grace is necessary, but it's all about accountability, because once again, you elected this person because you expected them to deliver on promises made, the social contract made between you and your community. Hold them accountable, but don't get mad because Bahamians, someone told me Bahamians don't vote governments in, we go vote governments out. And I thought that was interesting. So it's not even like on a row day you vote governments out. You need to hold people accountable and put their foot to the fire and say, this is all I asked of you, and you couldn't even deliver that. What makes you think I want you to be reelected in this situation if you cannot deliver the basic things that I asked for? And our politicians do have a problem with promising grand schemes, grand policies, grand legislations. Legislation is paper for politicians. And it's very hard to get what is on paper for politicians translated and implemented that really impacts communities and the individual and the everyday Bahamian. So whilst they're working on these overarching policies, do demand of your politicians things in your community that you can say, this is going to have a direct impact on me, and this is all I ask of you within our social agreement and within our social contract. And it's strength in numbers once again. Empower your community members to say, we as a community just want the lights on the park fixed,
Mhm.
and hold them accountable to that. Every constituency meeting, every community meeting, bring it up and
Yeah.
don't forget it. And stand firm in solidarity with your community members as well.
Yeah. That is I'm so glad you said that. I'm glad you like brought in this concept of there being a social contract because I do think by and large we have forgotten that these are people we have to some degree chosen, whether, it directly or indirectly, right? Through action or inaction, right? Like we are willfully selecting these people by one way or the other,
Mm-hmm.
giving them a certain degree of power, and so we have to check that power, like we have to keep that in check, and we do have, yeah, we have a role to play. We have another question, a follow-up question, that says, do we have any community organizations that support and educate the public on sustainability, etc.?
Not that I know of in terms of community organizations. I do know individuals within the sustainability sector, the climate change sector, and the conservation sector. I'll shout them out now. So we have Marjan, the climate expert. We have Amber Turner, Miss Sustainability, who also works on sustainable development goals. And we have Lashanti Jupe, who works in conservation, marine conservation. So I know of individuals themselves who really advocate for these things, but I can't say there probably are, but yes, I particularly don't know of community organizations. But there probably are community organizations that are out there,
Yeah.
and you should definitely do the research and reach out to those organizations for education initiatives on sustainability.
I just want to, shamelessly plug in Equality Bahamas.
And Equality Bahamas 242.
We do have a series with Marjan, actually. I believe the recording for that series is on YouTube. So you can check out our YouTube channel. And it was a series that they did, I believe, in October,
Mhm.
where if folks want to learn more beyond this conversation tonight, that they can.
Mhm.
We have another question. Um, and oh yeah, this is a good one. It says, do we actually have a disaster management plan in the Bahamas? I think of Dorian and there should be things we learned from it. So is there a plan in the event of a catastrophic event or something less?
Okay, so putting on my DRM hat on this one. So there is a national disaster emergency plan in place, but the current plan that we have in place is a bit outdated, as it stands now. So the DRM authority is working tirelessly on updating that because it's within the mandate of the legislation as well. So the legislation now requires the Bahamas and the DRM authority to implement a national disaster risk management plan, a national disaster emergency management plan, local body plans of the two plans. So plans for the national disaster risk management plan and the disaster emergency plan for the family islands, and that's every family island should have these two plans as well, and public bodies. So every public agency and ministry in the Bahamas should have these two plans as well. That's mandated in the legislation. So we currently do have a draft of the national emergency plan, but it is outdated and it will be updated within the coming months and years. It's a long-term goal for the DRM authority, but there is a plan in the work, and we're working tirelessly to create a more comprehensive and holistic approach to disaster management and changing the way we did things before, because there were a lot of lessons learned from Dorian, even with how we handle humanitarian aid from international entities, even how we work with NGO partners and civil society organizations. Lots of lessons learned came from Dorian, and all of that will be included in creating a more inclusive and comprehensive disaster emergency plan, 100%.
Okay. I kind of have a question to follow up on that.
Mm-hmm.
So, as someone that is a daily wheelchair user, I am always thinking about like what my personal plan of action is.
Mm-hmm.
In the event of any type of disasters, I live in America, mass shooting.
Mm-hmm.
I always, I'm looking for the nearest exit at all times.
Yes.
And so I think of myself and other vulnerable groups in the context of disaster management. And I'm wondering, is that something that we're thinking about, right, when we talk about this national disaster management plan? And I'm curious what strategies
Mm-hmm.
for protecting certain groups, vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
groups, the elderly, the disabled, children, women, like we have very special needs, especially
Mm-hmm.
in times of like disaster recovery and rebuilding and all that kind of stuff, right? So I'm curious, like, are we thinking about that? And if so, what does that look like?
I am 100% thinking of it. And because I'm in planning, mitigation, and research, I am making sure that that is considered heavily throughout our planning initiatives. So it is important for us to have a more inclusive approach to disaster management because that was one of the lessons learned. So, the vulnerable demographics in the Bahamas that were heavily impacted from Dorian, we have to be more considerate and focused on their daily needs. So, one of the policy instruments in the legislation is the National Humanitarian Assistance Standards, which speaks to the basic rights and dignity of human beings within a disaster context to have for their consideration and their safety in a disaster event. So, with that, we are considering having more a community-based approach to disaster management and really understanding the vulnerable demographic profile of the Bahamas from a community to community perspective as well. And then now having conversations and inviting those vulnerable demographics to have a seat at the table and have inputs on the conversation on what this plan should look like to include them. And I'm happy now that with that vulnerable demographic, I can say that times are changing. Times have changed, and with disaster response under the previous organizations, I felt like a lot of it became an afterthought. Like, okay, let's create this plan and then we'll have an afterthought of how do we include or be inclusive of these vulnerable demographics. And now with us being regional partners with SEDEMA and having the comprehensive disaster management model in the Caribbean, it calls for inclusivity. Even with the global agenda, it calls for more inclusivity. So those are embedded in the mandates of the legislation that it has to be inclusive of all of these vulnerable demographics. So there's multiple instruments or multiple governance structures within the DRM legislation that speaks to being more considerate and forthright with having vulnerable demographics considered. So even on the ground right now, we're working on shelter management plans and we're looking at in the event of a mass evacuation event or in a shelter management context, how are we reaching the needs of the vulnerable, such as the elderly? What specific needs will they have in a shelter context, even for the disabled community? How are we now identifying the needs of these specific demographics and making sure that their basic rights as human beings are being met within a disaster context in the shelter management system and in the shelter capacity? So that includes identifying or even building shelters specifically for these people to accommodate those needs, and even like women with children, building shelters specifically to accommodate the needs of these demographics and not making it an afterthought. No, it's very much integrated in the approach and in the planning process on these are included in our population, so they have to have a space or a way to preserve their basic dignities and making sure their needs are met in the event of a disaster.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important. We forget sometimes, like, especially in this day and age where there's more, I would say, LGBTQIA, particularly trans visibility, right? Like there's a lot of messy politics, for lack of
Mhm.
words, around that. And so we have to make sure, like, You can't be selective who we save, like you
Exactly.
gotta, get it together.
Exactly. And having their considerations met as well, because they are a visible and growing population. So we can't pretend that they're not here. That would cause more of a crisis and more of a disaster. So even with in our planning and policy strategies, it is very much on the table that this should have some type of consideration and inclusivity with our planning strategies.
Yeah. We have more Facebook chat questions. This one says, are there any concrete plans for protecting livelihoods? Is insurance viable?
Ooh, the insurance question. Concrete plans for protecting livelihoods. No, not at the moment, and not that I can speak to or speak towards. However, in the DRM legislation at Wells, it speaks to protecting livelihoods. So it's securing lives and safeguarding lives and livelihoods. So that is within the mandate of the DRM authority. So it's on the table, it's up for consideration. With it being a new legislation and being a new entity, we're only 5 months or 6 months into establishment. So it's a lot on the table that we're working on. So, but all of this is written in legislation. So we are accountable and held accountable to the legislation and the mandate. So that's there. And then the second part of the question was,
Is insurance viable? And I'm not quite sure what they meant, but
I'm not the insurance person. So I'm not the finance person. But if you can get insurance, I would recommend getting insurance in the event of a disaster because it will never hurt to have that cushion to fall back on in the event of a disaster. And it goes back to that social accountability contract that I spoke of too, with the expectations people have of government sometimes are a bit unreasonable. You can't expect government to pay to repair your private home that you privately purchase to get back to the standard in which it was before pre-event. This is a private purchase, this is a private ownership. Do you expect if you catch a flat on a pothole, do you expect the government to pay for your flat tire in the pothole? Don't answer that because a lot of people will actually say yes, because use the reason I have this flat in the first place because you didn't patch up this pothole that I asked you to do 2 years ago. Absolutely. But there comes some sense of personal accountability as well that we as citizens must have for our own personal assets and how we would recover from a disaster event, because it can't just be government doing everything for everybody. There has to be some level of reason, a level of reason that we have, and personal accountability within this social contract as well, not abusing the social contract that you have with government and taking personal ownership and personal accountability for your personal assets in the event of a disaster. So I would recommend people to get insurance, especially on assets that you really want to protect. Now, the issue is that with climate change, a lot of insurance companies are pulling out of climate vulnerable areas, or the premiums and the rates of insurance are increasing at ridiculous rates. So it's also the accessibility, because I feel like with a vulnerable demographic like retired people, disabled people, or people who are unable to work for whatever reason, not being able to access these insurance mechanisms because it's out of budget, it's out of price range. So I do think there needs to be some conversation on how do we make insurance more accessible for more people. But I would recommend getting insurance on really important assets and minimum your house for anything that can help you in the event of a disaster, and you could be able to fix up or repair your home with swiftness instead of waiting for the government with all this red tape and bureaucracy to give you $50 to buy plywood, because that's probably what you're going to get anyway. So,
so we have another Facebook question. This says, for someone studying public health and wanting to work at the intersection of health and the environment, do you have any advice for anyone looking to enter this sector and make an impact in the Bahamas? How do we actually get involved?
ooh, good question, big question. Everybody hitting me with the big questions tonight. What is going on? So, um, well, first of all, congratulations or great job on your interest with the intersection of public health and the environment, with disaster management being such an intersected or cross-cutting field as well. There's definitely room and opportunity for anything. When I first got my degree in disaster management, I knew it was important, but I wasn't sure that I could do something in this field. I never really heard of disaster managers before I started studying disaster management and what that looked like. So at first it may be daunting trying to figure out where you can actually fit in career-wise or what that looks like. My best advice would be I think what worked for me was networking, stalking people's LinkedIn profiles, people who I admired or people who were in positions that are just like, wow, I really like to do whatever it is I think you do, because you don't even know what people really do. So I'm like stalking LinkedIn profiles, I'm seeing what certifications they get, what kind of articles they read and write, and really staying up to date on the information in the field. And then finding connections and wiggling your way into institutions that you feel would be a good fit for you career-wise and that would speak to your personal and professional development in the field that you are interested in. Because I never want to tell anybody to get into a field that they're not interested in because passion and motivation is very important with picking careers, not just jobs, careers. And I picked disaster management because I didn't want to be bored. Pretty much. I just did my first degree is in economics, and I could not see myself sitting at a computer running numbers, doing finance and all this boring economic policy for the rest of my 20 something, 30 years in the future. So I was like, what's interesting? Disaster management. So definitely networking, seeing what people are doing and how you can approach yourself in those fields, even conversation, informational interviews with people that you aspire to be like and admire in the field and see what they're saying is the best approach to get in the field. Because I can't speak for the public health and environmental intersection and everything, but I would definitely say see what people are doing, see how you can do it, stay on top of information within your field so you can always have the best knowledge or the up-to-date knowledge in your field, and then just see how you can wiggle yourself into the companies and the institutions that they work at as well, and then take it from there. That's my advice. I hope it's helpful.
That's great advice.
Equality with homicide, wow, hurtful song and economics and finance major. Yeah, man, like, I didn't like numbers anyway. So me trying to do that for like 30 years? Oh no. I would not be happy. Oh no, baby. I can't do it. If you
No.
like it, I love it. I support everybody.
Jill, I saw you had your hand up earlier. Did you want to ask your question vocally? You're welcome.
Um, I ended up typing the question in chat. Do you want to just read it, or should I just read it?
Please
What?
read it.
Okay. Any comments on the state of public transport or vehicular infrastructure in the Bahamas? I mean, I already kind of did with the, with the justified rant on potholes and stuff. Uh, any comments on this for whichever island, I guess?
The state of
Also,
transport. Hmm.
also adding to that, it seems that the best way to improve, the public transport and whatever is to consider the community of persons with disabilities. But of course, I guess we don't do that because, as you said, some plan, the disaster risk plan was written like after the fact or something.
Yeah, the disaster,
Um,
the current plan is outdated, but it's being updated as we speak. And so the current state of public transport and vehicular infrastructure in the Bahamas, I think it's terrible. It's such a small island with so many cars. I think there's definitely room for improvement. And like you said, the best way to improve it is to consider the community of persons with disabilities. So I saw this tweet on X, formerly known as Twitter, said something about people don't understand how much easier life could be if we really start factoring in people with disabilities, because making their life easier makes our life easier in a lot of ways. Like we don't even think about it, like even like ramps or automatic doors and everything. Like these are all creature comforts or things that would make our life easier, but really makes a difference for the differently able. So if we start thinking about ways to implement that, like we could only benefit from these things in the long run. We definitely should start thinking about it as an inclusive mechanism with considering vulnerable demographics, such as the elderly, making things easier for the elderly makes life easier for us, making things easier for women with children, making things easier for the disabled community makes things easier for us. So it definitely should. But the state of public transport or vehicular, I have my own opinions on that. I'm not going to say them here. They may be a bit too radical, but there's definitely room for improvement and a need, even in a disaster management context as well. Like, I'm currently considering mass evacuation planning, right? If we told Nassau to mass evacuate, can you imagine the amount of cars flooding the streets of Nassau to go to the nearest airport or go to the nearest dock or go to the nearest point of evacuation? We would never leave. Like, the amount of time that it will take for people, everybody have their own car, absolutely ridiculous. So if we had public transportation systems and public transportation infrastructure already implemented, it would make something such as a mass evacuation event or an evacuation event in general way easier and way simpler. Just in my and then people, some of these cars should not be on the road. Um, I know y'all know people in road traffic, but they really should not be licensing some of these vehicles will just be breaking down every day. So imagine in a mass casualty event or a mass evacuation event, you have 1,000 cars on the road at the same time, traffic galore. We already see what traffic look like on a 3 o'clock day for school pickup. So imagine in a crisis hysteria situation, and then someone will whoopty break down on the road. We only got 2 lanes now. One of the lanes clog up, and now we still got like it's just all of this needs to be, and that's why I said disaster management is such a multi-sectoral approach, because within all of my disaster management thinking and my disaster management strategies, it can only benefit the Bahamian people and benefit the population if we really just become more strategic with how we invest in disaster management planning and strategies. And something as the state of public transport would make facilitating disaster management strategies easier in the event of something. So yes. Don't mind me and my rants and
Uh,
whatever I have going on, but yeah.
I just wanna say this, and I'm sorry I haven't said this sooner, but you cannot be too radical for this space. Like, go off with all of the things, you know? Yeah, we have another question and comment in the chat. Says, I was just perusing the act. It speaks to the prevention and emergency funds, but doesn't give an indication as to what that number should be or if
Mhm.
it should be. Is there a quantifiable cost for the worst case scenario disaster? How is that funded, and do we even have it?
So putting on my DRM authority hat right now as we're speaking to the legislation and the organization that I am affiliated and a part of. Um, so that's one of our main institutional goals. So like I said, the DRM authority was just operationalized in July. So we're like 5 months, 6 months into establishment, a huge mandate and a huge legislation with multiple moving parts while carrying on our day-to-day operations. So not to make excuses, but we got a lot going on. But this is definitely a priority with the prevention and the emergency funds, because it would help supply relief or aid or disaster management activities pre an event and post or during an event, and having that accessibility. So in terms of funding or seeding those two accounts, we do not have a number tied to how much can be is going to be committed to those funds. And I think it's actually really difficult to quantify the impact of disasters, because with how cross-cutting disasters really impact people, like, can you quantify loss of life? Whose life is valued more than another person's? Can you quantify livelihoods? You can in terms of salary and paycheck, but livelihoods sustain and support people, families, and communities. So it is getting a bit difficult. I know like a lot of these big banks, these multilateral institutions and developments love putting numbers on things and love quantifying things, with them saying like Hurricane Dorian was upwards of $7 billion of damages. But can we really quantify this? No. But once again, this speaks to the social contract that we would have with our government and them being committed to investing in disaster management activities. So a lot of the funding and the money for those two funds would have to come from government support. The government would have to seed some money into these funds for the protection and the prevention and the response efforts in disaster management. There isn't an exact number that we have that should be, but this is all ongoing conversation right now because it is a part of the institutional strategic plan and the institutional agenda of the DRM Authority to get these funds up and running as soon as possible. And with funds like this is also take some type of governance of the funds. It's not as simple as opening up a bank account and calling it the Disaster Prevention Fund and the Disaster Emergency Fund, because the legislation speaks to exactly how this money per fund can be used. And that comes with what qualifies as that category and what doesn't qualify as that category, and making sure we're in compliance with the legislation and what it says we can and cannot do with it. So it's going to come with some governance framework and some policies behind it to ensure that it's being funded, it's being maintained, it's being watched, and it's being used and allocated to areas where it's supposed to be allocated. But if you Google, this is not my radical side, but if you Google certain best practices in the world or what disaster organizations like the UNDRR or IMF or the World Bank say, I'm not going to say the number, but they say that government should commit a certain percentage of the country's GDP to the disaster management activities. Now, you can look that up for what you want and do the math on what the Bahamas' GDP is and what the percentage is and see how much money that is, and then say, this is what we should be reaching for on a best practice scale. But we have so many moving parts that I don't foresee that happening right now. But a disaster girly can dream on what it should be.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe, you will rise to politics and do what you say.
Exactly, exactly.
So, okay, we have another question from Facebook, I believe. It says, how come we don't have any shelters specific for our disasters besides the churches and gyms? Would we benefit from something like this? Something.
So yes, I'm excited to talk about this because we are working on this. This was a lesson learned from Dorian and a huge identified gap that we are working to address right now. So I do want everybody to really think that all of these things cost money, and we ain't talking about no pennies. We talking about big cents, big dollars, big guala, buku money. So it's going to take a while to implement these things, but these things are definitely on the table, and I'm excited about it. So the DRM Authority does recognize that there are no disaster shelters specified for disasters. For years and years, we've been relying on schools and churches and other personal or other personal structures to shelter for disaster management shelter. So right now, we are currently building a shelter or a specific building for shelters in Abaco. It's also going to double as a community center in Abaco during blue sky time. So it's not just going to be sitting there shut up during the year and nothing happening. So it's also going to be a community center in Abaco. It's expected, oh gosh, I don't want to say, it's expected to be completed soon. I was going to say this year, but we're in December, so I'm going to say within the first quarter of 2025, it's expected to be completed, and that's going to be one of the first purpose-built shelters. That's the phrase that we use, a purpose-built shelter. And once that project is completed and it's a big success, we're hoping to now implement purpose-built shelters across the archipelago on various islands and various family islands as time goes on, so we can have that. Because that was a gap identified, because it all goes down to, are these buildings that we're using that are privately owned or community owned even up to standard with the building code? And then how do you expect to use other people's building but not really helping them to be up to standard? And then in a disaster event, when something happens, people can't go back home. So people can't get back to business as usual with their buildings because we are still housing shelterees after a disaster event. So all of that's being into consideration, and we're in the process of completing our first purpose-built shelter through public-private partnerships, and we're hoping to implement those purpose-built shelters throughout the archipelago as well. And with inclusivity, we are making it disabled friendly as well, so people with special needs can go to the shelter in the event of a crisis.
Yeah, okay, so we have some more comments in the question. Dil M said, I'll quantify hurricane damage in the Bahamas. Every disaster is too much damage. Do better.
Exactly. Here, here.
And then we have another comment that says, "That's amazing." I think in reference to the purpose-built shelters. That
Hmm.
they're glad we're finally moving in that direction. And then Dill says, "I'd like it if there was a big animal sanctuary for all the stray cats for whenever hurricanes happened, but then they'd need ways to cross the roads to get there."
Oh my gosh, you're my spirit animal. I always said, like, if I became stupidly rich, I will have a potcake sanctuary on one of the family islands where I will like take every single potcake from every island and just have like a pretty much a reserve for them to like run wild and be themselves and take care of them. And then I also want it as a tourist attraction so you can come and feed the potcakes if you want, or if you want like a doggy de-stress day, you can come and hang out with my very friendly potcake friends. Yes, that is in my list of things to do when I make it rich.
Hey, you gotta keep the list long. So I am curious. Right now, we don't have any questions. Again, we do have a question. There we go. Go ahead.
Okay, I have so many questions that I would like to ask, but I'm going to start with loss and damage.
Mhm.
Does that factor into the work that you're doing? I know it was a really big topic at COP last year. They were really trying to get this deal, got a little bit of money, not a lot of money. This year was even more disappointing. But could you talk a little bit about loss and damage and what is meant by this term? And to go a little bit deeper, talk about non-economic loss and damage and how that is being discussed and worked on at DRM?
So I'll be honest and admit that I'm not the best person to talk about loss and damage. I know enough about it, but not enough to really have a thorough or well thought out discussion about it. And if it's a part of our DRM work, it's a part of it in the sense that we know that hurricane impacts or natural hazard impacts in the Bahamas do have a quantifiable cost on how much we lose. Like I said, I can't speak to what that actually entails and what that encompasses, but I know with the strategies and policies that we're currently working on, we're working on the prevention and mitigation sides of things so that loss and damage as an outcome of a hurricane or a disaster event is low. So we're really trying to invest in the preparedness and mitigation aspect of disaster management so as to prevent the negative consequences and the loss and damages of a hazard impact. So I can't remember what the actual phrase is, but they were just like for every dollar spent in preparedness saves $15 in recovery, something like that. So that's really what we're focusing on the DRM side, I can say. Was there a second part to the question?
I was gonna say, Alicia, get them all out.
I have a lot of random questions.
Oh,
Can you, I guess, make a case for mitigation? Because I know a lot of people feel like we're past the point of mitigation. So what is that looking like now, and why should we have hope?
I'm taking off my DRM hat and putting on my Master of Disaster hat right now. I can say at times it does feel hopeless with mitigation, especially when certain policies and practices are being implemented that go against or not in alignment with climate change or climate resilient mechanisms that we need to get on board with. And I know a lot of my friends in the climate change community are saying we are now past the point of mitigation and we've now reached the point of adaptation. And that's what we really should be focusing more on how we can adapt to our new normal in a sense. Like with COVID, life has not been the same post-COVID, so we have to adapt to our new normal. And life has not been the same post-Dorian, so we have to adapt to our new normal and our new realities. So in a lot of ways, I do feel there are a lot of hopeful people out there that think we still have a chance to mitigate. And not to say that we should completely give up on mitigation and mitigation practices as a whole, but we do need to start talking about being serious about adaptation because our current climate situation isn't even our fault. So, how can you expect us to mitigate things that we have no direct hand in the first place? We now just have to adapt to what the greater powers that be are doing and investing in our adaptation practices. And I like to make small jokes here and there about adaptation. And it could be, we also have to stop being so hyper focused on the bigger picture or the grand picture and what we can do as people on the ground and what we should be fighting for in adaptation. So one of the hazards I forgot to mention that the Bahamas faces is heat waves or extreme heat. It's getting hot. Um, Hashtag Trees for Our City is one of my initiatives that I think that we need to start planting more trees in New Providence specifically because it's hot. Everywhere is trying to be a concrete jungle and an asphalt jungle where if you put a few trees here or there, it really does cool the place down. So that's also an adaptation measure where you require every new development to have a certain amount of trees per square foot of the property. Something like that could really combat extreme heat. Or going away from our flashy dressing with you gotta wear a suit and tie and business suit to everywhere, go to work and everything. I mean, like, can't I just wear like a linen suit or something that can accommodate the heat? These are also adaptation mechanism and adaptation practices that do impact communities and impact individuals instead of just thinking about the grand adaptation strategies. So I can't say that the DRM is working particularly on adaptation. We are working on mitigation and using more data-based or science-backed approaches to mitigation with our policies and strategies that we're implementing.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going.
Yeah.
You mentioned like mass evacuation, having a serious issue in evacuating. I think a lot whenever there's a hurricane, major flooding, I think a lot about elderly people who refuse to leave their homes. And how are we supposed to manage that when we want them to be safe, we want them to survive? But there's also, they're trying to hold on to their independence and their comfort. It seems like there has to be a cultural shift, but also like a building of trust that there are spaces that they will be safe, that they will be comfortable. It's not going to be the Kendall GL Isaacs gym, right? Are you thinking about these kinds of things and how we can respect people's independence, right? And prioritize their dignity while also working to protect their lives?
Yes. So within the legislation, the National Humanitarian Assistance Standards, which are in final draft right now, hopefully to be completed within the first quarter of 2025, does speak to preserving that dignity. But I think when it comes to populations like the elderly or just in general with understanding safety and safety is an issue, it does take building that trust, and it also takes gatekeepers to really get that information across to them, because I think the elderly population are stuck in their ways and stubborn with things that they've previously experienced, and them saying, oh, it's not a big deal. I was in events way worse than this before and I made it through in my house that I spent all my time and money on, and you ain't gonna let me, I'm not leaving my guava tree unattended. If the wind blow it over, I gotta make sure I could preserve it and save it after the event. All of these things also comes from a lack of education about the new normal and the new reality of the situation that we're in. I don't think they understand I don't think a lot of Bahamian people really understand the severity of climate change and what's that doing to the natural hazards that we face and what's that look like. So I think it comes from a lack of education and lack of understanding. But like you said, when it comes to having that trust, you can't just have big bad government knocking on your door and telling you leave. They don't know you. They don't know you, bro. They're not leaving. So tapping into those community resources as well, and even having the community check for their elderly. Like, I am so big on social programs like this, where I wanted to start a program called Adopt the Elderly, where you just like hang out with an old person in your neighborhood like once a month or something to get to know them, or take them out so they can have some type of social activity. And I had this meeting with Ministry of Health one day where we're facing a crisis in the Bahamas when we have a aging population that we don't know what to do with and how to work with them, how to keep them involved, how to keep them entertained, not phasing them out and acting like they're pictures on the wall. Like, these are still living, breathing people with individual thoughts and opinions. So the DRM authority is working on installing some community-based programs for disaster management and really like getting into the communities for promoting the importance of disaster management. So I hope with those community initiatives, we can build some trust with people and have people listen to the DRM authority as the main entity or the I don't want to say competent authority, but the direct or focal authority for everything disaster management related and trusting the DRM to steer you in the right direction. But it also takes family and community to assist the elderly as well. Once again, social contracts also come with community. You have a social contract with your neighbor. You know, you expect your neighbor to not play music at an indecent hour. You expect your neighbor to respect your property lines and your boundaries. These are also a part of the invisible social contracts. But within that social contract of community, it's about building trust with your neighbors. So if you see Miss Martha down the road and you get an evacuation order and you see that she don't want to move, you need to go to her and like really stress it and be like, listen, we got to pick up and go. We'll check on the house when I come back, but we really need to go. So it comes with a lack of education, but also a lack of trust. And I think it's important for community members as well as government institutions to build that trust between people so they would be more willing to leave, because the government's not going to send somebody to risk their lives to save you. So you have to save yourself. And I think that needs to be promoted and advocated across the board to everybody.
Yeah, that is such a important point, right? Like we really got to get back to that place of caring about our communities at the end of the day. Like, yeah, I love this trees for our cities hashtag too. Like that is so clever. And I think, sometimes maybe people get so overwhelmed by the idea of climate change as this sort of abstract, thing that's not happening to us, or maybe it is happening to us, but because like Alicia said, like, or someone here said, like, we're not directly contributing to it. And so we feel like we just got to let it happen. We can't do nothing. But those are really meaningful ways that we could be making, some change for sure. Dylan has left some comments. Said, I have been getting on UB, albeit just on Facebook, for hiring dudes to be chopping all of its trees when cars be bursting in flames in their parking lots.
Yup. Hashtag trees for our city. Yes.
Scary. He said, I've wondered about the phenomena of people who refuse to leave their homes during disasters. I think it comes down to how precious their homes and their assets are and helping them easily move their possessions. And then
well, I just want to comment to that point. It's also about attachment. Like we are very attached to our things, especially things that we have invested a lot of time, money, effort, and memories. You know what it is to watch generations of children and grandchildren running through your house and now being told to abandon your house. It's the attachment. And it's also important to be respectful of people's attachment to their things, like stress the severity of the situation, but at the end of the day, let these people make the decisions themselves. And you can still encourage and promote evacuating when an evacuation order is committed, but it's definitely deeper. Like there are studies on behavioral attitudes and decision making in a disaster event that go across the board, because there are even religious beliefs and religious attitudes that also impact or contribute to how you consider disasters and disaster preparation, along with the social accountability and social contracts, along with your attachment to a place and thing. So it is a multifaceted, complex situation, and it's something to be worked on and considered. It's definitely not a full stop on that, but yeah.
Yeah, that is so true. Oh my gosh.
Yes,
Wow.
concepts of home, personal comfort, dependencies, and fear of the unknown. Because like you said, a lot of people say if an evacuation order issued, they stay in home. They don't want to go to candlelight exchange because they don't know what to expect, or they don't feel they want to be. If I have to ride out disaster, I can ride out disaster comfortably in my home instead of bunkered down with strangers and people that I don't know in a room that smell bad and people pumping and coughing and stuff. I ain't into it.
True. No, it is very, very true. As a person, yeah, that has certain dependencies that are private, like absolutely. I would rather
Exactly.
die with my dignity intact. Thank you very much.
Exactly. So that's where the national humanitarian assistance standards come in, that kind of give you international best practice on, at minimum, what you should be delivering to people in a crisis event. And that way you can, at minimum, let people know what they can expect in these situations, in these shelters and these evacuation points that they can go in. And allow people to make their decisions, but always promote safety over things.
Yeah. There is another question that's asking, are there any new ways of considering illegal immigrants during a disaster since Dorian?
Yes. So this is okay, I'm gonna flop between the two hats because this is a real question. This is a really important question. So I want to handle this carefully with both hats in tow. So the Bahamas and the Disaster Risk Management Authority, I think, does recognize the vulnerable population of undocumented migrants, and especially them being the biggest or the largest demographic that was impacted by Hurricane Dorian, 100%. And there are so many lessons learned out of Dorian, and all of this is being handled with care. Now, it's up to now taking off my DRM hat and putting on my Master of Disaster hat again. So I think it takes a lot of, I wouldn't say political will, but the government needs to get real on the undocumented migrant situation in the Bahamas and stop pretending that they don't exist, or that is not an issue that bleeds into multiple sectors and multiple social sectors of the Bahamian fabric, and figuring out the best way to approach them with dignity and care, because they're still people at the end of the day, and these people still have basic dignity and basic human rights as well. So um getting real with that situation, I would say that within the National Humanitarian Assistance Standards as well, in the first draft that we have, there is a section that says something along the lines of, people seeking shelter will not be persecuted for seeking shelter regardless of their status. So I think that is a huge thing to implement in a country like the Bahamas, and it's a first step in that implementation. Like I said, there's always room for improvement in everything that we're doing, but I think having these small first steps will eventually cause an avalanche of change over time. We do want these wins to be bigger, and we do want these considerations to be bigger, but I think that is a huge first step. I also think, in terms of communication, the Bahamian government and Bahamian people need to get real with communication. Yes, English is the primary and the main language of the Bahamas, but we do have an underground second main language. And I am of the belief that disaster information and disaster management information should be communicated in multiple languages for safety purposes and the protection of life in general, because Bahamas is on the world stage, and after Dorian, we were in a bad light for the humanitarian crisis of Dorian in terms of how we've treated our undocumented migrants. That's definitely on our report card and our reputation. So I hope that we can do things to make ourselves better, but I do believe, and this also, I want this to also be a call for civil society and civil organizations as well to help with that communication as well, because I think there are limitations in which the government can do from a legal perspective, from a political perspective, on what communications and how it should be always in English. But I would like for non-governmental organizations and community organizations to also step in and fill that gap where necessary, where if you have the resources and the capacity to translate or find a translator to translate this information, that's something I would definitely work on, but translate this information in the other foreign languages as well, so people can have access to that information for safety and protection of life as well. And the government is the government, and that's where I think community comes in with filling in those gaps. So are there new ways in considering illegal immigrants? As in, yes, if they need to seek shelter, they have all rights and should seek shelter from official government certified or government acknowledged shelters for safety, because now that's going to be implemented in the National Humanitarian Assistance Standards to grant them that permission to survive pretty much. And it's a baby step, but it's a step all the same. And I'm happy that we're making these steps in general.
Yeah, you got to start somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have another question. Go ahead.
Yes.
I think one of the biggest risks that we have, and that became clear in Dorian and the aftermath of Dorian, is that I want to say most people in the Bahamas cannot swim. Is this being taken into consideration at DRM? Are there plans to reduce this risk by ensuring that everyone has access to swimming lessons, especially those that are still in school?
So this is funny, and thank you for this question and this consideration because I personally knew that a lot of Bahamians could not swim and cannot swim. My mother can't swim. So that's definitely in the forefront. I bought my dog's life jackets, and these are all serious considerations. So that the Bahamians out there who can't swim, I would encourage you to invest in those personal assets to assist you in survival. But in all of our community preparedness and community resilience initiatives, I didn't even consider something as simple as that. And I think that would be a huge community project or program and outreach to teach people how to swim. So thank you for putting that on my radar. I'll definitely go back and say we need to do or we should do something like this because that is such a simple thing that really has a huge trickle down impact in the long run, for real, for real. So yeah, thank you. That's good. Hashtag learn to swim. Absolutely.
Do we have any more questions on Facebook or anyone here has any burning questions they want to get off their chests? Harris, I also wanted to ask you if there was, if there was something that someone didn't ask tonight that you wanted to comment on or share or
Okay. Um, Wearing my institutional hat again, I want to tell everybody that never think that it can't happen to you in the terms and in the context of disaster management. Nobody expected Dorian to do what Dorian did, and it did to us. And even this year with Hurricane Beryl plowing through Jamaica and almost hitting Trinidad and Tobago, and the other, like even the state, which state is this? North Carolina that got like impacted by what was it? Oscar Milton, one of those. Um, in states that have not experienced hurricanes or events like that ever. So their infrastructure and their people were completely unprepared for a situation like that. So with this changing climate that we're in, it's important to really invest in your disaster management strategies, and it's important to advocate for national disaster management strategies, holding your government accountable for the social contract that you do have with them by you electing them into power and making sure that you are still around to live life and see your children, your children's children, your dogs, your pets, your plants, your garden, everything can survive through a disaster event. And I also want to say, bring back community in terms of crisis. I think Bahamian people really do rally in times of a crisis. I can't say I've seen that firsthand with a lot of situations, but sometimes I feel like the situations are a blimp in the overall picture in terms of, yeah, we could rally behind a person in this situation for injustice and stuff, but in a time of crisis, and I heard stories that in Grand Bahama and Abaco, community really did come together. Like people, neighbors really did help each other. And I want to keep that spirit of community and momentum going across the Bahamas, across the entire population of the Bahamas, to really be there for your neighbors and really be there for your Bahamian brothers and sisters and really be there for anybody and everybody in the Bahamas when it comes to disaster events, because it could be any of us at any time. All it takes is one hazard to really change everything. And statistically, a lot of Bahamian people are living paycheck to paycheck. So really do extend grace, care, and consideration and build that community. Know your neighbors, know Susie down the road, No Hubert down the hall. Really get to know your people and have those social safety nets and social community, because in a time of crisis, that's who you really lean on at the end of the day. The government takes a while, and you really have to tap into your community resources. So I do want to encourage fostering that community preparedness aspect of everything. I think that's the main thing that I want to say. Hashtag trees for our city. Start planting trees, real trees, big trees. Tell these people stop cutting down trees, and they ain't even sticking up like solar, like the solar panel garages or whatever. Like, it's just hot. So plant some trees. That's what I want to say. And take disaster management, your personal disaster management, seriously. Truly invest in the tools to keep you safe and prepared in a disaster event, because it could really make a huge difference when that time comes. Don't wait last minute to get supplies. Get supplies and gain supplies in these blue sky times. So when a gray sky time does come, you are already equipped and prepared with this long-term investment plan. So that's what I want to say.
Really good. Yeah, really good advice. We have a doomsday question that came up, and I really like this one.
Oh.
Has any plans for the time that the Bahamas loses ground, literally, and we become climate refugees? Discussions with countries about granting status to Bahamians?
I think about this all the time because, like I said, it really takes one disaster event to change everything. I don't know if that's currently on the table with any government officials, if that's a topic of discussion, if they're discussing that with anybody. We really should look to partnering with other countries, because it don't even feel like the US want us at some time. So where are we going to go? Because the US right there, right? So you got to explore your options. That's actually one of my disaster tips. Have out of country or out of state contacts in case you do have to evacuate and you have to bunker down with other people and outside entities. So I don't know if that's on the table for the government to consider, but it is a true reality and a true consideration on where would we go if something bigger than Dorian or more catastrophic than Dorian, or if Dorian hit Nassau, God forbid. What are we going to do when 75 to 80% of the population is on this one island? Really? Climate doom. But I don't want to get into climate doom. I want everybody to go outside, touch grass, pull a Cinderella, start singing with the birds, take your dog on a walk, support BAIC and our local farmers, buy your local produce, support your national parks, go take a walk in one of the national parks, all of that. Touch grass. Remember, we still have this one life to live, and it's a beautiful life, and nature is all around us. So really take your shoes off and walk in some grass. Be careful of dog poop, but enjoy nature as is. Don't get too caught up in the doom and gloom. And remember to enjoy life.
Yeah, that is such a good, reminder. I have another question that just came up in the chat. So it says, piggybacking off that question, is there an island that we can go to if something that catastrophic happens to Nassau?
Letitia, I know Letitia, Ragged Island. No, but I actually don't know, because it is a discussion, because once again, I'm tired of everybody overdeveloping New Providence, because we have all these islands and keys that we really need to pour into and invest in the event that something happens in Nassau. You do have another island to go to. Not Andros, because Andros is actually a giant mangrove swamp. There is a lot of land in Andros, but Andros also has like a lot of Andros is a nature reserve. It's a national park too. So it's tricky. Andros can do a lot for the population, but it's not the end all be all. So I do encourage us to diversify our economy, diversify our institutions, and really pour into and develop our family islands so we can mitigate one of these risks of where do we go if something happens to us, because Ragged Island can't hold all us. So we really need to start investing in infrastructure on the other islands to accommodate us. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about this mass evacuation plan. I can't imagine everybody pulling up to the
At the
dock.
airport, and on Cubes, Paso, and Swift
And
pulling up to the airport at one time.
imagine trying to get away on the ferry. The ferry would go so slow. Oh
You
God.
can't even hit the dock because it's traffic. How you even get into the dock because of traffic? Like, seriously, these are all considerations. So public transportation, investing in public transportation would be a huge win for us, not even just as a accommodation and accessibility and creature comfort, but also in disaster management strategy. I'm naturally a doomsday thinker, so I think about this stuff all the time. So I try to not think about it too much. But these are considerations like what you're gonna do. You gotta pack up the Swift and hit the airport. As soon as you pull out your yard, traffic in front of your yard, so where you going? So
Wow.
stuff like that.
Yeah, these are a lot of, yeah, good things to consider. Does anyone else have any questions, any doomsday questions, any questions that you think might be too scary to ask? I mean, can't top that. Oh,
So would you essentially have to target more than one island? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because Nassau, to me, sinking right now with the amount of people that on it. So, and you also don't want a situation where you are bogging down an island's abilities and capacities with an overflow and over influx of people as well. So you do want it would be strategic to spread out in the event that we had to mass relocate people to have options to mass relocate so that it does not overwhelm that island's capacity and that island's resources, because you are now going into other people's territory. That island was functioning to sustain the people that it expected to sustain. Now you have more people coming on there for example, in Maikal, Mayaguana, Inagua, Acklands, Crooked Island, Long Key, the boat comes like every 2 weeks with supplies. So you also have to factor that into your strategies on how can we get resources and supplies to people, and you don't want it to be an overflow and overflux. So it would have to be a mass island or multiple island relocation plan and strategy, 100%. Can't just be one. If you could be on Ragged Island by yourself.
listen, I will go wherever, yeah, I can find shelter at that point.
At that point, exactly, 100%.
Wow, this is really, yeah. Alicia says Bahamians need to change the way so many regard our Caribbean siblings. Amen. Our best chances are actually in the region, from what I can see. Yeah.
100%. And that's why, as I'm talking to you, I'm currently in St. Kitts and Nevis at a conference with SEDEMA, which is the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, which is the regional coordinating agency for disaster management in the Bahamas. They're hosting their Road to Resilience conference this year. So we are here meeting our Caribbean brothers and sisters to really collaborate and foster that partnership and more collaboration with our islands and the region, so we can learn from each other and we can be there to support each other in disaster management. So I'm happy to be sitting here at this conference. It's going great, learning innovative strategies for disaster management implementation and policies, using technology in disaster management, building community resilience. All of that are topics on the page of the conference. So the DRM Authority is working closely with its Caribbean partners to really strengthen that bond for the region.
Yeah. I'm curious, I guess, since you're like in that space, have you, despite like other, excuse me, countries not having like legislation that we have recently enacted, right? Have you seen, other countries in the region doing things that you're like, oh, that's actually really good. Like we could learn from that. Like, are there any lessons that?
Yeah, so in terms of community, like I'm not even in comms, but learning different communication strategies that other countries are doing that are still very cultural or based in their cultural understanding of things, because I do feel like Bahamians try to cherry pick things from other countries and then take that, but they don't Bahamianify it. So it misses a huge demographic and a huge population, whereas they just played a video today or yesterday about using local radio personalities to speak on the radio or run a commercial on the radio, and they had like these thick accents, thick dialect, all of that stuff in like disaster preparedness tips and promoting that on the radio. And I'm just like, yeah, I would love somebody with a thick Bahamian accent to go on the radio and tell you prepare for a disaster and make it an interaction in which people enjoy listening to it, and as time goes on and you keep repeating it over and over, it really instills, because everybody know the Shoe Village anthem, and they was playing that anthem from I was in primary school. So stuff like that really sticks in your head, and everybody knows Superwash washes and brushes and cleans you 24/7. So stuff like that, if we could make disaster management sexy and educational but fun, and really integrating it into the lifestyle and the culture of the Bahamas, I would really appreciate that. So definitely learn that here from our Caribbean partners. But I will say that a lot of our Caribbean partners are also watching us, the Bahamas, which I'm very happy of and I'm very proud of because I think the Bahamas has a unique context to offer to disaster management because we have so many islands. And with this new legislation, a lot of them are watching us because they all have a NEMA situation where their disaster management coordinating units or their entities and agencies are departments and agencies in government. So there's that bureaucracy and that red tape really prohibiting them from doing, and the lack of investment from government prohibiting them from doing a lot of the things on the fly and in a flexible manner. So they are watching us and our legislation to see if it's working for us, and a lot of them want us to succeed because they see the potential that they have, but they are watching to see if it's going to work or if it's going to flop. So we can't flop because all eyes are on us in the region right now, what we can do. So I'm really excited and looking forward to that. But I'm happy to be here and like meeting all the national disaster coordinators here and learning from them and their experiences and their war stories and really incorporating best practices from the region. So I'm a big FUBU supporter with for us by us. Let's really support our regional knowledge and our institutional knowledge from the region instead of these, I'm not going to say the word, but instead of these other people that don't understand our cultural context and don't really understand our history. So I'm happy about that.
That is so important. Like that is a really, really, I think, big piece of like how we educate, people in general about like how to be thinking about things and what they should be thinking about is like we need to make it culturally relevant, a
Yeah.
lot of stuff is really just not. And so yeah, I'm glad you had that takeaway and I hope or at least I look forward to hopefully hearing some jingles on the radio next time I come.
Okay. Speak our Bahamian dialect on the radio. Tell people to button up.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Oh man. Yeah. Dylan is thanking you there in the chat for making us think about how bad traffic will be in a serious part.
Oh gosh, Dylan, that's not the only thing I want you to think about. Don't think about how bad traffic is gonna be. Think about touching some grass, getting outside, going for a walk, plant a tree. Also think about that. Think up.
I mean, we'll think about those too, but also the traffic. So, so thank you for all the things you'll be making us think about.
Thank you. Thank you for participating. I appreciate it.
Well, yeah, this was a really good session. I think you've imparted some really good knowledge. We have another comment here saying, I wish there was a way to have regular conversations with people in different sectors that contribute as well.
Yeah,
So yeah.
man, hit me up. I'm like accessible. I have a Facebook page, I have an Instagram page, my email is everywhere. So like if you ever want to talk, because this is my jam. So if you ever want to talk disaster management, I am definitely there. And I do deliver tips and strategies for disaster management on my blog. I'm also on LinkedIn. I'm everywhere to talk about disaster management. So if you ever have like a random question, please feel free to pop up and I will wear my Master of Disaster hat and not the DRM Authority hat to let you know what it really is.
I know I had seen like y'all have been doing Q&As on Facebook. What
Yes, I was doing.
That was really informative for me. So I was curious if that's like a series that y'all intend to continue or
I think it is. I think, yes, I was the test dummy essentially, but I was the pilot for the Ask the Expert series. And I do think that they are going to now have more experts, and I hope it's across different sectors to give expert opinions and advice on their sector in disaster management. Yes. So you can check out the video on there too. Also follow the DRM Authority page. Like I said, they are your first trusted news source for everything disaster management related for the Bahamas. And also follow the Department of Meteorology's Facebook page for weather updates and events because our meteorologists are super duper smart, super experienced, and they know exactly what's going on in the Bahamas for the Bahamas. I know we like to watch foreign news at MSNBC. We like to look at NHC, the National Hurricane Center, for information, but follow the Met Department because they know exactly what's going to happen for the Bahamas. So super duper smart people.
So we are about halfway through our 16 days of activism campaign, and I am sharing the link for those that want to register for events we have later on in the week. We have events tomorrow, Saturday. Um, there you go. And Barry's has dropped her socials and her handles in the chat so y'all can follow. But y'all sign up for the remaining lineup of events we have going on for the rest of this week. Follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. And Alicia, do you have anything else you'd like to remind folks?
Just that the next session is tomorrow, Thursday, December 5th, and we will be hearing from Taitu Heron, who is a Jamaican based in Barbados, who conducted research on femicide in the Bahamas, Barbados, and Jamaica. So it will be really interesting to hear about her findings when she started looking into the sex and gender-based killing of women and girls in these three countries. That session, again, is December 5th at 6 p.m. And you can register for it at tiny.cc/16 days Heron, Heron. And then we move into in-person events. So people who are in New Providence, come hang out with us. We are going to be at Poinciana Paper Press a lot. On Saturday, we'll be there from 10 to 5 for a printmaking day. So you can drop in at any time between 10 and 5 to make your own stamp, like literally carving your own stamp and block printing. And you can also print your very own bandana using screen printing with Margot Bethel. And the stamp making will be with Sonia Farmer. Monday, very exciting. We have a writing workshop with Stacey Ann Chin. If you don't know who Stacey Ann Chin is, you need to go to Google right now, go to YouTube right now and type in Stacey Ann Chin to see some of her work, some of her poetry, super, super powerful. And she's going to be guiding us through rage writing. So I think we're going to be writing some poetry and steam is just going to come off the page, I think. The next day, Tuesday, we are back at Poinciana Paper Press again with Sonia Farmer, who will teach us how to make a book, handmade books. And these are books for us to take home and write all of our rage. All of the details are in the link that we've shared in the chat and in the comments on Facebook, tiny.cc/16 days 24. You'll see all the registration links for all of the events, and we hope to see you, if you're in New Providence, in real life, and if not, tomorrow virtually.
All righty. Thank you so much again, Barry's. Thank you everyone for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Yes, and thank you, Equality Bahamas, for this dialogue and this conversation. And thank you, Khadijah. It's so great to see you again. And thank you for the conversation.